Okay.
So Dr. Clark Knight is a postdoc researcher at the USGS, or the US Geological Society, in Menlo Park, California. And there she's currently focused on producing well-dated, high-resolution reconstructions of past climate to understand climate variability in Western North America, particularly around extreme hydrological events like atmospheric rivers. I think a lot of us are probably a lot more familiar with some of these terms, and we know the importance of that. Clark is also a recent graduate from UC Berkeley's PhD program in environmental science, where she conducted research about historical ecology of California forests, which is a lot of what we'll be hearing about today. Okay, I think with that, feel free to take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacey, for that introduction. And it's great to be with you all today. I recognize some names in the viewer list, so thank you so much for joining in. This work that I'm about to talk about stems from a recent publication in the Journal of Environmental Management that myself and the folks on this title slide contributed to. And I'm excited to talk to you about it because I think the work relates to some of our most pressing questions in California around fire and forest management and the modification of our forests to help modify fire behavior. And specifically, this work is part of my interest in forestry. So Stacey mentioned, I have a lot of interest in historical ecology and paleoecology and climate, but I'm also really interested in what's happening in our forests and in the terrestrial side. So excited that we were able to put together this work, and I'm going to talk about the main findings from this paper first, and then there will be a chance for Q&A, as Stacey mentioned, and then the second part will be going through kind of the lexicon and the methods that we use to show you or provide these results, also with a Q&A. So the title of this work is California's 1 Million Acre Goal, Tracking Our Progress. And the rationale behind this really comes from the mandate that the governor put down. But in general, there is a really big need in the state of California as well as globally for forests to track what is happening in those forests accurately. This is really important for sustainable forestry management. You can't manage what you're not measuring. And so this really comes from those fundamental principles. But within California, Governor Gavin Newsom put forward this ambitious million-acre initiative where the state would be treating 500,000 acres per year of California forest lands, and they were also asking that the US Forest Service contribute 500,000 acres of treatment. So this joint, US Forest Service CAL FIRE initiative should be up and running by 2025, according to this goal. And this opportunity to do work in California and look at our progress towards this million-acre goal also allowed us to have a case study of how you might integrate successfully multi-jurisdictional data sets. So we have data from the state and data from the federal government, but we're applying it to California issues. So our first goal with this project was to quantify and understand what treatments have been done on our landscape since 1984. That's really when the beginning of a lot of these data sets were collected. And then understand what our trajectory is towards this million-acre goal. How close are we? We're going to be able to answer that with this work. And then our second goal was to create what we're calling a refined data set, where the archival records that the state and the federal government have put forward can be checked with remotely sensed data from Landsat, and then are then combined to form this hybrid data set that we think is probably the best representation of what is going on the ground. And so a lot of this comes from California's need to modify fire behavior in our forests, as I mentioned. There was a really nice video that was put together by Emma Cott, a video journalist for the New York Times, who actually quoted this work. And that was really cool. If you have some time to watch this video, I highly recommend it. And as I mentioned in this talk, I'm going to be first just presenting our main findings from the paper and then delving into the methodology. So to jump right into what we found is we looked at two main data sets from the federal and state government. We looked at the FACTS data set. So FACTS up here, it's a forest activity data set that the US Forest Service puts out as well as several of CAL FIRE's data sets, which we've combined all together to make this state and federal data set. And so just to walk you through this main panel of our findings is when we look at what activities have been completed on a landscape since 1984 through 2019, which is our cutoff point for this paper, is that you can see there's been an increase in completed activities on the landscape through time. This is good. This tracks with our growing ambition to treat the landscape. However, what's interesting about this is that if you look at the amount of treatment that has happened on the landscape in terms of a footprint and compare that to the total acres, if you summed up multiple treatments on the same footprint of land, is that a lot of the increase that you see over time is actually due to repeated treatments on the same piece of land. So the main difference between panel A versus panel B is that we've removed these repeated treatments. And that, I think, gives you a better idea of what new land is being treated on the landscape. And when you zoom into that, I have colored it here with a red circle, is that in 2018, 2019, about 300,000 completed footprint acres have occurred on the California landscape. And when you think about the goal that was put forward being 1 million acres, that goes to show that about 30% of new land is being treated towards this 1 million acre goal as of 2019. So we're sitting only at about 30% of where we want to be. If we look at the intensity of these treatments, we wanted to understand what kind of treatments were being done in the landscape, and that information is in these data sets. We can see that the majority of the silviculture treatments that are being done are in the medium intensity category, followed by the high intensity category. So these are things like clear cuts and commercial fins and some forms of prescribed fire. So that was an interesting way to bridge these two federal and state data sets, is to have this intensity ranking, which I can talk more about later if folks are interested. And then this panel on the right also shows what I just mentioned, that medium intensity treatments are growing on the landscape through time, and they're the most dominant treatments. So specifically, if you look at the federal data sets, the two main data sets in this, what's put forward by the federal government, are the timber harvest data sets, which are shown in blue, and the hazardous fuels data sets, which are shown here in orange. And what you can see is when you look at completed activity acres, is that you see this really sharp increase in what's being done in the hazardous fuels data set, and then basically a static amount of timber harvest or even a decrease. But when you look at completed footprint acres, so removing those sequential or duplicative treatments on the same footprint of land, is that you see this massive drop. So the main takeaway here as the difference between A and B is that a large number of sequential treatments are occurring in the FACTS hazardous fuels data set, which I will get into a little bit later. And also within CAL FIRE, CAL FIRE does not have this difference between footprint acres and completed activity acres. They just have footprints. There wasn't sequential activities in their data set as far as we could tell. But we can see here is that the trends are pretty variable, especially in the last decade. They go up and down, but the last couple of years there has been an increase, which is great. And the main takeaway is that about 3.3 million footprint acres have been completed on private land since 1997. 2.8 million were from commercial timber operations. Then we had about 240,000 from prescribed fire. And lastly, about 284,000 footprint acres are from CalMapper, which is yet another data set that CAL FIRE puts forward, which has the vegetation management plans. And again, a lot of these treatments are classified in this medium category. We were also interested in what kind of cover types were being burned by CAL FIRE, and this information isn't readily available. What we had to do was merge the CAL FIRE prescribed fire data set with the coverage of vegetation types in California, a spatial data set, and then look at where the most burning was occurring on those different vegetation types. And so when you actually break it down, the majority of prescribed burns are occurring in hardwood forests. So this blue line here, about 45%, followed then by shrubs at about 18%, then the mixed conifer and hardwood forest at about 15%, pure conifer forest 11%, and then herbaceous and other. And this other category includes things like just barren land or agriculture. So we were surprised by this, and we wanted to break down these cover types even more with even more granularity. And we did that, and we looked at the classification by these landscape alliance types. And what we found in terms of the completed footprint acres of prescribed fire from CAL FIRE is that most of them, as we said, were occurring on these montane hardwoods, but they were occurring in mixed chaparral. Annual grasses here is number 6. And then actually in 8th place is the Sierra mixed conifer. And we were curious about this ranking because a lot of the prescribed fire science and literature is showing that prescribed fire treatments are most effective when they are done on landscapes like the Sierra mixed conifer, that the longevity of those treatments really has a huge payoff for protecting those landscapes versus landscapes like annual grasses, which the longevity of treatments is very short. So we were curious and also a bit surprised that the Sierra mixed conifer ranks so low, given the usefulness of those treatments. And we think that that's probably due to some of the difficulties of doing prescribed fire in this context. You know, it's much harder to burn in a forest. There's more logistics than, say, a landscape with just annual grasses. So we think there are some important reasons for that, but we hadn't seen it laid out quite like this for California before. So we thought that was interesting. Okay, so I want to talk about our refined data set because so far I've just been quantifying what the state and the federal government puts forward, but we wanted to actually understand for ourselves how accurate those data sets might be. So what we did is we used machine learning to understand this. We created what we called a refined data set. So we have here this yellow polygon, which was an algorithm trained on Landsat data in California. And it represents a continuous change detection classification algorithm. And what it does is it's picking up changes in the reflectance of the landscape. So green comes up as a reflectance. If there are changes, then it will pick it up, green to brown, it'll pick that up as a change on the landscape. It's a very good algorithm. It's been used in a lot of different contexts since 2014 when it was put forward. We have now applied it in California. And what we did is we compared the CCDC algorithm to these known archival records. So the red polygon here shows what is actually from either the FACTS federal data set or CAL FIRE's data set. And in this example, this is actually NAPE imagery underneath. We used Landsat data to train the algorithm, but NAPE imagery became very important because we went through and we checked a random selection of our refined data set to understand if it really was picking up what we thought CCDC should be picking up on the landscape. So we had trained a bunch of analysts to go in and look with NAPE imagery to see if they could compare how well CCDC was doing to the archival record. So basically we had them compare how good does the yellow polygon look compared to the red polygon in terms of capturing what we think the treatment area was. And those results were pretty interesting. What we found from this refined hybrid data set is that there's actually possible over-reporting in both agencies in terms of the area of treated landscape. And these are plots from the 4 main data sets within FACTS and CAL FIRE. So we have the hazardous fuel data set, the FACTS timber harvest data set, as well as CAL FIRE's timber harvest plans and non-industrial management plans. And you can see the original archival area treated per year is plotted in black. And then our CCDC refined polygon treatment area is plotted in red. And for various data sets in various years, you can see that the overlap is quite different and that for the most part, the original archive area is greater than what CCDC is telling us was treated based on the remotely sensed data. And we think that this over-reporting could be due to several factors, but probably the biggest one is that overreporting was occurring when you had treatment types such as uneven age silviculture that were mapped such that the entire footprint is in the archival data set, but really a smaller footprint a relatively small proportion of that footprint was actually treated. So something like a group selection where you go in and you take out clumps of trees, but you're not doing like a clear cut, which would remove everything within that polygon. So there's a bit of there are examples like that in silviculture treatments where you wouldn't actually treat the full landscape, and so that footprint is not as filled out. And that could be contributing to this possible over-reporting. But lastly, what we wanted to do was to project how well we think the agencies are in their planning, how well they're doing. And we looked in the data sets because there are treatments in these data sets that have been completed, and there's also treatments that are planned but not yet completed. And so we wanted to understand, are we on track with what's in the pipeline as a planned treatment? And unfortunately, the answer is we think no. So if you look at the planned footprint acres shown in red in the database versus the completed acres, is that if you were to add up the two completed and planned footprint treatment acres for a given year, is that they're still far below 1 million acres. So for example, in 2018, we have about 300,000 completed treatment footprint acres versus about 120,000. That's far below 1 million acres at this point. So we're hoping that that can be increased and that this work can help as a baseline or a benchmark for understanding what has been done and what needs to be done. So I'm just going to pause there because these are the main themes of our paper and a lot of the main results. And I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty in the next section, but I'd love to take some questions at this point from folks.
Great. Yeah, thanks. So, if people are new to this, we're going to do like two kind of sections. So the methods and stuff, as Clark just mentioned, are going to come up next. So if you have some kind of general questions about what's been presented so far, that'd be great. And I see we have the first one, which is how far apart in time did two activities on the same acre have to be in order to not be considered duplicative for the FACS footprint analysis?
Yeah, hi Sarah, this is a good question. So what we're calling duplicative records, the way we know that something is duplicative is because there's an ID number that's attached to every event that's in the data set. So if you are treating the same piece of land, it will have the same identification number. So even if it's treated, a year later, it will show up with that same ID number. And so we removed everything that had more than one instance of a second event. So it wasn't time-based at all. It was just based on whether that piece of land was ever treated again.
I mean, I'm going to follow up on that one.
Yeah.
For that, there are some ecosystems that like the return interval is actually, maybe only a decade or so. So was there any consideration of maybe keeping some of those in as separate events? Or was it just the vast majority were just so back to back that it seemed like necessary to exclude them?
Yeah, so that's a good point. We know that there are real management reasons for having and tracking, these sequential events. A lot of times you want to go in and take stuff out and then burn it, and those should all count as events for management purposes. We did not take into consideration what the time interval was between those events. We were just wanting to account for what the area and acreage would be from all of those events. But that would be a really nice secondary analysis. Actually, we hadn't considered it in all the things we were doing as what those time intervals would be. That's a good point.
And then a little bit more clarification. So if a same area is treated even a decade later under a different NEPA, would that get the same ID?
Oh, interesting. I actually don't know. There was a column with some NEPA information, but we did not look closely at that. Yeah, I wish I had an answer. That's a good point. I would like to go back in the data and see if that's the case.
And then I have one real quick. So again, feel free to put more questions in the chat, but I know there's been a lot of conversations about even using acres as a good metric for success. And I know I appreciated going into like different kind of levels of, low to high kind of treatment types. But was there other discussions about other metrics that we could start using that like maybe are a little bit more reflective of
Yeah.
ecological restoration or even hazard reduction?
Yes, Stacey, that's an excellent question. We thought about that and we discussed it a little bit in the paper about the idea of impact acres. So, there's this known phenomenon where if you have a treatment on the landscape, even if it's small, it can protect an area much bigger around it. And trying to quantify that so you actually understand what the impact of that treatment is would be the probably most valuable metric that I think you could have in terms of this. Unfortunately, we were actually kind of inventing some of our own lexicon for this paper because we couldn't find uh, terminology around what even is like a treatment per se and what it counts. So that's why we came up with this terminology of completed activity acres versus footprint acres, which I'm going to go through the definitions in the next piece as well, but I absolutely think a bigger discussion needs to be happening about what the best metric is, because you don't want to have a situation where you have all this data and you're data rich, but information poor. You really want to maximize what you're going to be getting from your data because it's a huge effort to collect a lot of this. And so you want to make it worthwhile. So I think impact acres would be potentially a way to go, but that's just one idea.
And this might be a little bit more into the methods. Maybe you'll
Okay.
end up touching on this, but Sarah also asked for the prescribed fire by CWHR analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have standardized as proportion that type instead of acres? And would you see the same order?
If you standardize a portion of that type instead of acres. Yeah, we did. We also did not do that. We just had what you saw. I don't know the answer to that question either. Sorry, Sarah. Um, how much of that type exists? Ah, I see, relative. That's a good question. No, we did not standardize it to how much of that type there is in California.
And then
Great
lastly,
point.
and I think we'll move into the next section
Mhm.
after this, but was managed fire, was that included in acres treated?
That's coming up. Yep.
Okay,
That's in the next section. It's a really good point.
perfect. Great segue.
Yeah.
I'll let you take it away. Thanks.
Okay. Cool. Let me just close the chat. All right. Okay, so a lot of this work really stems from our need to bridge this different agency data. So as I mentioned at the beginning, a multi-jurisdictional data set. How do you begin to combine what you have from US Forest Service with CAL FIRE? And what we found from this project is that it requires quite a bit of data cleaning and finagling to merge these two data sets. So we worked with 6 data sets in this piece. We had 2 main ones from the US Forest Service as well as 4 from CAL FIRE. And we had to get them all in the same format with all the same kind of data to really do this apples to apples comparison, which is why we had to come up with a lot of the terminology that I've been using in this work. But first, I just want to touch on this duplication piece because we again had to deal with the sequential events that are in this data set. We called it interduplication when you had multiple sequential events within one data set. So for example, the US Forest data set has, or the US Forest Service has a hazardous fuel treatment data set. If you had, for example, a 100-acre plot, you could have many different types of treatments occurring within 5 years. For example, you thin something out, you pile up those thin fuels, you then burn them, and then you come back a few years later and do another underburn. You can calculate them, add them all up and say we had 400 completed activity acres over 5 years, or you could say 100 completed footprint 100 completed footprint acres have occurred on this landscape. So there's that. Then there's also another kind of sequential event, which is sequential events or repeated treatments that are actually listed in 2 different data sets, but are being applied to the same exact piece of land. So for example, in the US Forest Service hazardous fuel treatment data set, they might have a thinning event occur and then also put in their timber harvest data set a biomass removal event. And then year 5, if there's an underburn, that will go in the hazardous fuel treatment data set. So actually this one piece of land is shown in 2 different data sets. And so you could, again, have 300 completed activity acres or 100 completed footprint acres. So that's how we try to coherently think about this. And then we also, with our lexicon and this apples to apples comparison, we came up with completed footprint acres, which is that unique area of land. So that just 100 acres, comparing that to completed activity acres, which is just the sum of everything that has been done, whether or not it's in both data sets or in one data set multiple times. Okay. So when we clean the data sets, I just want to give one example of what that cleaning looks like, because I think it can be kind of amorphous when you have these giant data sets. But for example, with the US Forest Service is you have the contiguous United States has data, which is actually great because we think a lot of our work could be applied outside California, because the US Forest Service FACTS data set is in many different states. But what we did is we first clipped that huge data set just to California. We classified our treatment intensities to high, medium, low, and then these variable categories, which you saw on the first slide. And we filtered those activities to planned management treatments only. And I'm going to explain what planned management treatments means in the next slide. And then we filtered those treatments to just those that have been completed. So not ones that are upcoming on the docket or in the pipeline, but ones that have actually occurred. And then we also collapsed those sequential treatments to get footprint acres. So that's how we got our 2 mean variables. But to Stacy's original question, no, we did not include things that were not management events. So for example, this is in the US Forest Service data set. We have timber harvest on the left and hazardous fuels on the right. And, you know, there's a lot of different activities that we classified as non-management. So for example, administrative changes. We don't think that that has a management purpose, so we took it out of the data set. Or permanent land clearing, again, remove that. But what's really important and what really accounts for a lot of the acreage is this category of wildfire that the US Forest Service has in their hazardous fuels treatments. So they have wildfire with a fuels benefit, wildfire from human ignitions, wildfire from natural ignitions, and wildland fire use. You know, just these 4 categories account for almost 1 million acres of treatments, and we classified them as non-management events. So we took that out of our totals, but they are in these data sets and they're important to keep track of. We acknowledge that definitely. But when you're talking about what people are doing specifically and purposefully on a landscape, we did not think that they qualified, so we removed them. Okay. So that's kind of in a nutshell. I know that's pretty quick, but it's in a nutshell like how we dealt with these data sets. And I wanted to mention here that all of our work is publicly available. So if you want to play with these data sets and look at the cleaned version and the refined versions, you're more than welcome to. They're supposed to be up on the California Ecosystem Climate Solution website. I think there's been a bit of trouble getting them up there, but I've just been sending it to people directly. So if you want to email me to get access to those data sets, I will send them to you. They're ready to go. And there's also accompanying R code, so you can look through how I cleaned all the data and clean it yourself a different way if you're interested in different aspects of the data. So I'm very happy to share all of that with any interested parties.
Great. Okay, we're going to go into Q&A now. First one is probably pretty easy. Does your data set go through 2020?
Hey, yeah, so it does not. We started this work back in the end of 2019. So we captured everything through 2019, worked on the project in 2020 and published it last year. So that was the timeline. It's pretty easy just to get that data. So in our paper, you can actually just click on the data warehouse links that we provide, and it'll take you right to where we downloaded the data. So you could just capture everything from 2020 and 2021. Okay.
And then the next one is, Is effectiveness taken into consideration? So for example, if a prescribed fire treatment might leave standing dead shrubs, that could actually create more severe fire than
Oh,
before.
no, we had no way of measuring the effectiveness of the treatments, actually. So yeah, I mean, a lot of this work is really what is the impact, what is the meaning of doing these treatments, which the current data set doesn't comment on at all. So therefore we can't comment on it. But yeah, it's a great point. I wish I had an answer.
I know you did look at the different levels of treatment, right? Like
Yeah,
the low to high. Do you feel like there could be anything taken from that to kind of think about effectiveness?
that's a good point. So actually, I should probably explain how we came up with those intensity rankings. They're in part based on our expertise, folks on the paper um, in silviculture treatments and management, as well as a correspondence with what you can actually detect from a satellite. So like a high impact treat or a high intensity treatment will be very detectable from a satellite. It's something like a clear cut. It's unmissable basically from the perspective of a satellite. But you can also have very effective treatments like underburns, and because they're not changing the canopy layer and are not detectable from the skies, they're not going to be noticed. And those are highly effective, low intensity treatments for the most part. So it's a tricky area because you want to be able to accurately track it, but there are just some kinds of silviculture treatments that are much harder to detect. I'm not sure if I'm totally answering your question, but yeah.
And there was maybe a clarification, like thinking about
Okay.
fuel loading and continuity, but it sounds like that's not something that this data set could really um,
No. Yeah,
shed light on.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um, I guess Sarah's question was next.
Yeah. So given the new 10-year wildfire strategy of the US Forest Service, any current intention to do the same facts nationwide at this point?
Yeah, I have not taken on that project. I've been approached by some people who are interested in doing that. I think our framework and the code we have could be applied pretty easily to facts. So if someone wanted to do it, I think they have a really nice um, launch pad to do it.
And then I think the next one is, have you looked at what Washington Department of Natural Resources is doing to monitor treatments on all lands for their east side restoration strategy?
I haven't heard of that, no. I would be curious to hear how they're monitoring those treatments, if there's a better or different way to do it. This is, one approach using satellite imagery, but there are probably many other ways too. So yeah, if you want to type in the chat what you learned or what strategy or what we could learn from that strategy, that would be really interesting.
And then another one from Sarah. Given that in forested ecosystems, thinning followed by prescribed fire is generally more effective than thinning alone, you could probably use that duplication data set to ask some questions about relative effectiveness.
Oh, that's a great point. Yep. Yeah, I think I know we've been approached by some people who I think are doing some follow-up like in fires um, in the Sierra Nevada that have gone through there, and then that also had treatments done before the fire went through. So I think some people are really interested in using and leveraging facts and CAL FIRE data set to answer questions like that, which I think is great.
And then the next one is, do you have any thoughts or recommendations on monitoring methods or standardizations?
Yeah, after spending a couple of years looking at these data sets, I have a lot of thoughts on what I think could make it easier. Um, as someone who wants to use these data sets in a certain way, they're not actually really made for that. They're made for the management objectives that the agency wants to look at. So there's going to be a mismatch, I think, no matter what. But I think I was wishing the whole time I was doing this project for some kind of README file that really just goes through the purpose of, the different data columns that are provided, what given acronyms mean, things that seem kind of simple, but and people in the agency probably are very familiar with, but as a person in the public, I didn't know what they meant. So Thankfully, with both CAL FIRE and the US Forest Service, is that I was able to talk to people who could just provide that metadata. But I think really meticulous metadata would be my biggest wish for these data sets, as well as maybe a different metric, as we were alluding to earlier, that Stacy had asked about, would be a really nice addition.